US guidelines are for how much radiation you're allowed to be exposed to. What is it that Italy, China, Russia, Salzburg, Austria, New South Wales, Australia know that our government doesn't know? Why are their limits so much lower than the US limits? The next set of boxes, as you move left, the gray boxes, are a lot of the effects that you get from different levels of exposure. And you see at the top left it says power density. I told you that's how they measure your exposure to microwaves. So all those little gray boxes show you different interesting things like childhood leukemia, impaired motor function, reaction time is affected, memory, altered white blood cells, headache, dizziness, fatigue. All the way down on the lower left, near the red box, sleep disorders, weakness, fatigue, pain. Look at the small amount of exposure that causes those kinds of symptoms. I added the little red box. I had another study that showed 100 yards, so 300 feet from a cell phone, somebody talking on a cell phone, you're getting almost enough radiation from 300 feet away from somebody else's cell phone. You're getting enough exposure to have these kinds of problems. Again, built up over time, the exposure over time. Now, think about walking down a busy street on a weekday at lunch hour. How many cell phones are operating within 300 feet? How about within 100 feet? Because the closer it is, the higher the impact, the more rays you're getting exposed to. And while all these phones are going off, how much concrete sidewalk, how much asphalt road, how much metal buses or trucks or plate glass windows, these rays are ricocheting all around you. You are being bathed in radiation. And these are the kind of symptoms that you can expect. So why isn't the FCC protecting us? Okay, the FCC guidelines are written as an exposure limit per person, and very specific to smart meters at the frequencies that they're operating. The per person limit is about, in their, power density is about 600 is their number. Now the way it gets enforced is not how much are you exposed to walking down the street with all the metal and glass and cell phones. It's enforced in a ridiculous way. Somebody wants to get their smart meter approved, so they apply they do their testing and they submit it to the FCC and they say, see, we're only about 1/3 of the allowed limit. We're only at 200, and the limit says we can be 600. Approved. They get stamped approved and get an FCC ID number. And this goes on for every smart meter, every cell phone, everything you're exposed to. So how much are you actually getting exposed to when you add up everything that's all been allowed to go to the maximum 600, but you're exposed to dozens or even hundreds of these devices that are all allowed to go up to the 600, and they pass. They're approved. What the FCC guidelines was designed around was the military. They looked at, young, healthy, 6 foot tall, 200-pound men, and they were looking at their radar stations. How much radar, electromagnetic radiation can they be exposed to before they start to cook their flesh? They were looking only at heating. They weren't looking at other effects. This is where I say they averaged the emission over 30 minutes because from a heating concern, you can put your hand quickly over a candle and it doesn't burn you. If you start leaving it there, it starts burning you. So the time duration is important when you're looking at heating effects. It's totally irrelevant when you're looking at these other effects. But this is how they designed their guideline, was around not burning up the flesh of young servicemen. They look at protecting from one device alone because, again, the servicemen are servicing this one radar installation, so they're looking at the one device. They're not looking at this multitude of devices you're being exposed to walking down the street. They look at one single exposure. Again, they're looking to keep the heating from reaching this certain point. So this limit is set around if you're exposed once in your life and never again, what's a safe limit? It's not looking at being exposed all day, every day for the rest of your life. So bottom line, when companies say, oh, we're safe, we meet all the FCC guidelines. Well, okay, so they have FCC compliance. Compliance is not safety, it's just legal. From a 1993 internal FDA memo, it was stated, available data strongly suggest that microwaves can accelerate the development of cancer. They knew that way back then. From a 2002 EPA letter, The FCC's exposure guideline is considered protective of effects arising from a thermal, a heating mechanism, but not from all possible mechanisms. Therefore, the generalization by many, read all of these device manufacturers, that the guidelines protect human beings from harm by any or all mechanisms is not justified. These guidelines aren't protecting you from the non-thermal, the bioeffects, like the communication disruption in your cells. It's not looking at pulse signals as being any different than continuous wave. And just for the record, studies have shown pulse signals are 28 times as damaging as continuous wave signals. They don't look at that momentary peak emission, that little blue star that I had on those spikes. They're not putting a limit on the peak emission, just the average. They're not looking at emissions from other simultaneous devices. They're not adding up the smart meters, the Wi-Fi, the cell phones, everything that you're exposed to as you're sitting in your internet cafe, or you're sitting at your Starbucks drinking your latte. They're not looking at the devices added together. They're looking at one device at a time. And they're not looking at the accumulation. You would think that our government would have decided how much you can have, say, over a year's time and be safely exposed. They've never looked at that. There's also no provisions for the very vulnerable, in addition to children, elderly, pregnant women, anybody immune compromised, anybody who has some kind of a chronic illness. All those people are especially vulnerable and are more easily damaged by the microwaves. They also have no provision for the nighttime recovery period. You can put up with a lot of this microwave radiation if you had a chance to get away from it, produce melatonin, and fix the cells that are damaged. If you never get a chance to fix them, you just keep accumulating more and more damage. So how much radiation are we talking about? In 1980, background microwave was about 0.005 on the scale of power density. They call it microwatts per centimeter squared. Now, in urban centers, it's about 0.4 to 100 microwatts per centimeter squared. Background radio frequency radiation has increased 20,000 times. Wireless smart meters, this is before smart meters. This is cities without smart meters. This chart was put together before the smart meters had been rolling out. Wireless smart meters are going to add that layer of red that you saw with the households to this amount. Potential chronic health effects could add to healthcare costs. Prevention is key, precautionary principle. So what does this all mean to you? FCC regulations do not protect against all effects. Residents' exposure is much higher than admitted by utilities. The low radio frequency radiation mimics and interferes with your cell's communication. It's turning things on that are supposed to be off. It's turning things off that are supposed to be on. RFR is a toxic accumulant. The effects of exposure build up over time. Bottom line, wireless microwave communication is not acceptable for the smart grid. As David talked to you, there are other alternatives. It shouldn't be wireless. Thank you.
What we're going to do, we're going to be taking a short intermission, approximately 10 minutes. So it's 8:30. We'd like everyone to be back by 8:40. If you need to use the restroom, there's the men's out this door and the ladies out the other way. There is, I think there's food or coffee available upstairs on the top of the stairs if somebody wants to get them.